War is taught as chaos, a breakdown of order, a moment when civilizations collapse into violence and destruction. Yet beneath the smoke and shattered cities, something else was moving with cold precision. While civilians ran for shelter and soldiers fought for survival, a different kind of war had already begun long before the first gunfire echoed across borders. It was not fought in trenches or skies, but in quiet offices, in trade negotiations disguised as diplomacy, and in secret contracts written in ink instead of blood. The world believed war was the failure of systems, but in truth, war was also the consequence of systems functioning exactly as intended for those who saw conflict not as devastation, but as business before the great global conflict erupted into open violence. Nations were already experiencing a silent transformation. Economic tensions were rising, industries were consolidating, and powerful financial interests were slowly positioning themselves to profit from whatever outcome might follow. While political speeches were made about peace and stability, factories in multiple nations quietly restructured their production lines, preparing not for peace, but for supply demands that only war could bring. The world appeared to be preparing for recovery, yet the machinery of industry hinted at a different future. A world preparing to heal does not expand steel production, stockpile fuel, or draft emergency logistics, plans for mass shipments across continents. The public believed their nations were standing on the brink of crisis reluctantly. Newspapers published dramatic headlines about peace conferences and negotiation summits, giving hope that diplomacy could prevent another catastrophe. But behind those public statements, certain circles were preparing models, financial projections, and contingency plans, not for avoidance of conflict, but for how to extract maximum advantage from it. The idea of war as a marketplace was not spoken aloud. It was simply assumed in the way resources were allocated, in the way trade routes were secured, and in the way investments shifted quietly into sectors that only thrived when nations bled, as tensions rose between world powers. Official narratives focused on ideology, sovereignty, and honor. Yet, in quieter reports never shown to the public, attention was fixed on steel output, fuel reserves, and material control. Nations spoke of pride but calculated capacity. Governments declared their desire to defend their people, yet they struck silent arrangements that ensured supply chains would remain open even if their armies clashed. It became increasingly clear that while diplomats discussed peace, other forces were preparing to ensure that no matter who fired the first shot, the machinery of profit would not be interrupted. The public did not see the early shipments of industrial materials crossing borders under neutral flags. They did not hear the coded messages between trading syndicates ensuring that production would meet demand from either side of the conflict. They heard speeches about national unity, but never knew of the quiet networks that considered war demand a predictable economic cycle. Conflict was being treated not as a catastrophe but as a phase of expansion, no different from industrial booms or infrastructure surges, just significantly more profitable and significantly more controlled by those who never saw battlefields. When the first bombs fell and borders ignited in conflict, ordinary people believed history had entered a moment of uncontrollable chaos. But for those who had prepared in advance, chaos was an illusion. The logistics that supplied the front lines were prearranged. The pricing models that dictated how much a shipment of fuel or armaments would cost were drafted before warfare officially began. Contracts were signed under the language of emergency necessity. Yet many of those agreements had been drafted long before the world acknowledged that war was inevitable. For most, war meant loss. For a hidden structure of influence, war meant predictable return. This was not accidental. It was systemic. Entire supply infrastructures were arranged to ensure that if one side needed materials, shipments would find a path through neutral territories to reach them. The same was true for their opponents. Neutrality became less about moral distance and more about maintaining uninterrupted trade flow. Repackaged under the guise of humanitarian aid or industrial assistance. At the surface, nations condemned each other. In the shadows, they sustained each other enough to keep the conflict going, just long enough for profit to peak before collapse. This was the beginning of the war market, a structure so integrated into global conflict that it operated almost invisibly, masked by patriotic language and justified under necessity. It is here, in these hidden exchanges, that the true nature of war as business emerged. Citizens marched believing in duty, leaders spoke of sacrifice, and history would later write of valor and defeat. But in the quiet archives of financial ledgers and transport records, a different story was recorded. One not of flags and victories, but of supply, demand, and return on investment. The world saw war as tragedy, but certain circles saw equilibrium, a balance between destruction and production, between bloodshed and profit. They did not need to win the war. They only needed it to last long enough. As the first year of war unfolded, nations adjusted to the shock, and economies shifted from civilian production to total military focus. Civilians stood in ration lines, unable to buy basic goods, while front lines demanded endless streams of equipment, fuel, and ammunition. To most people, shortages were a sign of national sacrifice. To those watching supply chains more closely, shortages were signals of controlled distribution, limitation for some, opportunity for others. War had successfully restructured society into two parallel realities, one of scarcity and fear, and one of controlled supply and strategic abundance, in shadowed meeting rooms, untouched by bomb blasts. Conversations flowed not about patriotism, but sustainability of conflict. The calculation was cold, but logical. War should not be so overwhelming that it destroyed markets entirely, nor so brief that it ended before profits matured. It needed to exist at the threshold where destruction created need and need created dependency. In that dependency, influence could be bought, negotiated, and traded like any other commodity. Nations publicly condemned their enemies. Yet through neutral intermediaries, raw materials still crossed borders. The flow of steel, fuel, and spare parts did not follow flags, but contracts. Ships sailed under false registries, documentation was altered to reflect humanitarian cargo, and transactions were layered through financial institutions that specialized in moving wealth across conflict lines without drawing attention. War did not stop trade. It redirected it through quieter channels, where fewer eyes could follow. Even as the world believed battle zones were clearly divided between opposing forces, there existed a hidden layer of cooperation among those who needed the war to remain balanced. If one side collapsed too quickly, markets would destabilize. If one side gained too much control over resources, it would no longer require external support. The ideal scenario for those managing supply and demand was not victory or defeat, but sustained struggle. The longer the conflict lasted, the more predictable the demand became. And predictable demand is the perfect environment for controlled economic growth. Factories far from the front lines thrived in this climate. They did not wear national insignias or wave flags. They operated under efficiency metrics and production quotas. Workers laboring on assembly lines believed their efforts were for national defense, unaware that replacement parts and fuel components were also being routed through intermediaries for distribution in places that newsreels described as enemy territory. They were told they were saving their nation. In reality, they were fueling a cycle that had no allegiance to borders, only to continuation. Governments issued public statements demanding total devotion to the war effort. But behind closed doors they engaged in negotiations not to end the conflict, but to manage it. Peace was too unpredictable. Peace could reset markets, erase debt, restore independence. War, when properly managed, provided rhythm. That rhythm created employment, controlled populations through fear, and justified strict economic regulation. A society at war was a society easier to mold. Diplomatic cables, later revealed through post-war leaks, showed how certain officials deliberately postponed negotiations that could have shortened the conflict. The reasoning was never stated openly in moral terms, but in logistics, readiness, and preparation. The conflict had to continue until certain infrastructure was in place, until certain trade routes were secured, until long-term contracts signed under emergency war clauses were locked and irreversible. War became a stabilizing factor, not for the people suffering it, but for those forecasting returns. Merchants of stability, disguised as merchants of chaos, moved quietly in the background. They backed both sides just enough to prevent total collapse while ensuring neither could fully dominate. They did not need to control governments directly. They only needed governments to require constant supply. Each prolonged battle became a spike in demand. Each destroyed city a new reconstruction opportunity. Each offensive a chance to move more resources under urgent classification. When destruction becomes profitable, peace becomes the real threat. Citizens were shown images of battlefields, believing that war was defined by the clash of armies. They did not see the stream of cargo ships quietly docking in neutral ports. They did not read the coded language in trade documents where war materials were renamed as industrial goods. They did not witness the carefully calculated agreements that maintained a supply equilibrium, ensuring that no army ever fully ran out of the means to continue fighting. In public, nations swore they would starve their enemies of resources. In private, they ensured the supply chain remained unbroken. As factories increased production, as ports moved endless shipments under the cover of darkness, a new class of influence emerged. It did not wear uniforms or salute flags. It did not care which anthem played on Victory Day. It only cared that the drums of conflict never fell silent before the final payments cleared. The warfare economy thrived not because war was chaotic, but because it had become predictable. Predictability can be managed, and what can be managed can be turned into a system. War had officially become more than a conflict of nations. It had become a marketplace. And in this marketplace, the true victors were not on the front line. They were watching from a distance, reading numbers instead of casualty reports, monitoring supply routes instead of military maps. While soldiers marked territory, others marked profits. While leaders gave speeches about sacrifice, contracts were quietly renewed under the justification of national necessity. The war, for those who structured it, was not a tragedy. It was working exactly as intended. As the war escalated, the world saw two narratives unfolding at the same time. One was loud, emotional, filled with speeches, parades, and declarations of heroism. The other was silent, calculated, spoken only in quiet offices where deals were drafted under the language of necessity and international interest. The war front was where soldiers died. But the real movement of power happened elsewhere, in boardrooms, in embassies, and in financial corridors where information moved faster than any army could march. Governments spoke to their people about total commitment. Yet between themselves they maintained diplomatic channels designed not to end the conflict abruptly but to manage its momentum. Nations that appeared bitter enemies in public still exchanged intelligence through intermediaries. Neutral territories became meeting points for quiet agreements where terms were discussed not in the language of war, but in the terminology of trade balance, resource security, and post-war influence. Negotiators learned to speak two languages. To their populations, they spoke of honor, sacrifice, and endurance. Behind closed doors, they discussed the timing of offensives, not merely to gain territory, but to keep the conflict from burning too quickly. If a campaign advanced too fast, there were pauses justified as strategic regrouping. These pauses were, in truth, moments to allow supply chains to catch up and demand to remain stable. A rapid victory would destabilize everything that had been set in motion. A prolonged war could be planned, modeled, and managed. This created a strange paradox. Publicly, leaders insisted that every sacrifice was made to achieve swift victory. Internally, they organized conflict like a long-term project. The language of finance crept into military strategy. Terms like capacity, projection, equilibrium, and sustainable output appeared in reports that never reached the public eye. Leaders who once spoke like warriors began to speak like accountants, measuring progress not only by strategic gain, but by projected material consumption rates. Nations that seemed ideologically opposed still relied on each other's continued resistance. The longer both sides stood, the longer the supply mechanism remained essential. Victory for one side would mean the dismantling of the current trade structures. A sudden end would force the closure of emergency contracts, trigger economic resets, and return control to civilian markets, where unpredictability and unrest might follow. In private conversations, officials admitted that war, though brutal, created a form of predictability. Surprising as it sounds, there was a stability in destruction that peace could not offer. Diplomats became managers of controlled escalation. They shaped conflict not to end it, but to align it with broader timelines of infrastructure projects, debt restructuring, and global resource distribution. A delayed offensive here would align with a newly secured trade route there. A postponed negotiation would allow time for investment channels to finalize. Agreements that would only hold value if war remained active. In this way, diplomacy transformed from a tool of peace to a method of managing conflict efficiently in neutral territories. Small offices lit by lamplight became nerve centers of this hidden diplomacy. Representatives from opposing sides would enter through separate doors to maintain appearances, only to review the same documents in back rooms where language was stripped of moral dimension. Materials were listed in tonnage. Delivery times were scheduled in quarters rather than weeks, and projected casualty numbers were noted not as lives but as resource consumption. Behind these numbers was the quiet assumption that war was not just expected to continue, but required to sustain the structure being built around it. The world outside saw borders drawn in blood. Inside these hidden rooms, lines were drawn on paper, marking zones not of ideology but of resource interest. Regions were evaluated not for liberation potential, but for extraction value. Campaigns were redirected not because of moral urgency, but because the territory contained rail junctions, mineral deposits, or access routes that could influence supply calculations. Soldiers believed they were fighting for freedom. The architects of this controlled conflict measured land in terms of logistical influence. Even humanitarian aid routes became woven into this network. Shipments labeled as medical supplies often included industrial components repurposed upon arrival. Relief convoys were sometimes redirected to regions where they were needed less, but where their presence could secure diplomatic leverage. Humanitarian language became a mask under which material influence could travel freely without scrutiny. To the public, this looked like compassion. In ledgers, it looked like investment. As war dragged on, people began to ask why it continued despite so much suffering. They did not know that for those managing the deeper layers of conflict, continuation was the goal. Wars end when one side collapses completely or both sides agree to stop. Neither scenario was beneficial to those who profited from sustained demand. Collapse would erase markets. Peace would cause contracts to expire. Only balance ensured continuity. A balance where neither side won completely and neither side lost entirely. This balance was not accidental. It was nurtured. Negotiated pauses, redirected offensives, selective support through neutral fronts, and controlled release of resources shaped the rhythm of conflict like a pendulum. When one side weakened, just enough support would find its way through indirect channels to keep them standing. Not enough to win, just enough to keep fighting. In this balance, war transformed into something more than a clash of armies. It became a system designed to maintain itself. The world saw trenches, smoke, and ruins. They saw defeat and triumph. But under that surface, an invisible design had taken hold. It was a war not merely fought but managed. Not for the sake of victory, but for the continuity of a cycle where destruction created demand, and demand created opportunity. That cycle awaited its final phase, not in the screams of the battlefield, but in the silence that would follow when rebuilding began and new markets opened among the ashes. When the cannons began to fall silent and the world prepared to call it peace, a new phase silently emerged beneath the celebrations. Streets filled with flags, announcements declared victory, and exhausted soldiers began to return home to the ruins of cities that barely resembled the places they had once known. Yet even as the smoke lifted from collapsed buildings and scorched fields, contracts were already being drawn for what came next. For those who had watched war, not from trenches but from offices, the end of conflict did not signal closure. It signaled transition. The war had merely changed form. The world called it reconstruction. Those who understood its inner workings called it the next opportunity. Cities reduced to rubble were now vast fields of potential labor, steel, and engineered supply. Governments spoke of rebuilding and hope, while their financial departments negotiated multi-year agreements that would see new infrastructure, new roads, new energy systems, all coordinated by the same networks that had supplied the conflict. The same routes used to move weapons would now move construction materials. The same hands that signed war deals now signed reconstruction tenders. War had not ended. It had rebranded itself. Ordinary citizens believed that peace would bring freedom. Instead, they found themselves woven into a system that monitored, rationed, and directed their labor in the name of recovery. Entire populations transitioned from war fatigue to reconstruction fatigue. The language changed, but the control remained. What had once been called military necessity was now called economic priority. Urgency justified decisions before, and it continued to justify them after. Under the new vocabulary of progress, The logic of war economy simply evolved into a logic of recovery economy. The purpose was no longer to sustain conflict, but to sustain dependency. Nations devastated by bombing needed to be rebuilt quickly to prevent unrest. But fast rebuilding did not mean independent rebuilding. Terms were set so reconstruction would rely heavily on external contracts, imported machinery, and advisory oversight from distant institutions. Assistance came with conditions, and those conditions ensured that supply chains established during wartime would remain intact long after. A new form of influence had taken hold, one not enforced by soldiers but by credit agreements and infrastructure dependencies. Sovereignty became a word spoken proudly in public speeches, but negotiated quietly in financial offices, where future access to resources and strategic assets was signed away in return for rebuilding assistance. People celebrated the end of air raids but did not realize they were entering a different form of control. Factories that once produced weapons for war were now repurposed to produce construction parts, fuel components, and energy grid materials, all under the same oversight frameworks. The narrative told to the public was that innovation was driving the future. In internal documents, the goal was described differently: stability, long-term contracts, market locking. When a city was rebuilt using a certain supply chain, that chain became embedded into its economy for decades. Reconstruction, when managed, could secure influence more deeply than occupation ever could. In classrooms, children were taught that nations had emerged from war stronger through resilience and unity. In reality, much of their post-war structure was shaped by agreements made before the peace treaties were even signed. Behind every new bridge, every new energy plant, every new transportation hub lay a web of terms that ensured a percentage of resources, profits, or trade privileges flowed quietly back to the same circles that had sustained the conflict. These agreements were not seen, not voted upon, not discussed in public debates. They were written in the language of recovery, efficiency, and modernization. And who could argue against modernization after such destruction? The era after war did not erase the influence of those who had managed its supply chains. It legitimized them. Awards were given for reconstruction efforts. Public figures praised the speed of development. Newspapers published photographs of newly built cities rising from the ashes, calling it a triumph of human spirit. Hidden behind those photographs were financial signatures, logistics models, and control strategies designed to bind nations, not through military occupation but through economic integration. The world saw a rebirth. Those who signed the documents saw an acquisition. The memory of bombs and gunfire faded, but the structures built during reconstruction remained. Power did not display itself through banners and marches. It embedded itself in contracts and infrastructure. The cities stood tall, rebuilt from ruin. But beneath their streets ran networks of control that could not be seen on any public map. The war had ended, but the system it built had not. Citizens would walk through modern streets, unaware that the same forces that once supplied the conflict had supplied their reconstruction. They would believe that peace had brought independence, not realizing that dependency had simply changed its uniform. And in distant rooms, where documents are stored away from public eyes, the numbers continue to move quietly, indifferent to flags, borders, or the passing of generations. History recorded the war as a chapter of destruction. The hidden ledgers recorded it as an era of expansion, stability, and calculated return. War was never only about victory or defeat. It was about continuation. And in the world that rose from the ashes, continuation had been achieved. History often ends its chapters with parades and declarations of peace. But what you have just seen is a reminder that behind every war, every treaty, every moment of silence, there are forces that do not rest when the guns fall quiet. They simply switch strategies. If this episode made you question the version of history we are taught, then do not stop here. There are more files to open, more truths buried under official narratives, more hidden motives waiting in the margins of textbooks. This is just one chapter. If you want the next one, stay with us. Welcome back soon to Hidden History Files.